Be careful what you click on. Some people make their living that way. I didn't flinch. I just adjusted the Velcro on my wrist brace and took a sip of my stale church hall coffee. Eleanor said it from across the room, her voice pitched at that specific volume she'd perfected over 40 years of leading committees. Not a whisper, not a shout. The whisper-loud register of a woman who wants everyone to hear her while pretending she didn't mean to be heard. She was looking at the dessert table when she said it, but the line of her shoulder, the small tilt of her chin, the way her free hand patted Mrs. Halloran's forearm in mock concern, all of it was aimed at me. My name is Tessa Drummond. I'm 35 years old. I run a cybersecurity company called Drummond Sentinel that, as of that Tuesday evening, was protecting the digital infrastructure of 2 federal agencies, a regional banking consortium, and the dependent accounts of roughly 4,000 military families across 3 branches. My grandmother had just told the congregation of First Pentecost on Magnolia Street that I was running internet scams. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The chafing dishes hissed their sterno fumes into the air. 200 people in folding chairs and at long banquet tables were eating dry chicken and green bean casserole, and not a single one of them looked surprised by what Eleanor had said. That was the part that hollowed me out. They'd already absorbed it. The warning was just maintenance. I picked up my paper plate and walked back to my table near the side door. My right wrist was already aching from the humidity, the black brace damp where the Velcro met my skin. I sat down. I unlocked my phone under the edge of the tablecloth. A push notification from our threat console. Drummond Sentinel had just blocked 3,000 malicious login attempts on a federal server in the last 90 seconds. Automatic quarantine had isolated the originating cluster. No human intervention required. I swiped it away and picked up my paper plate. 2 tables over, a young man in a dark suit sat very still. High and tight haircut, the kind you don't get from a barber shop. Dress shoes polished to a wet shine. He was picking at a paper napkin, folding and unfolding the same corner, and his father, Deacon Miller, was up at the front of the hall fiddling with the projector cables. I'd never spoken to the son. I didn't know his name yet, but I noticed him the way you notice a man who is not relaxing. He was watching the room the way I watch a network. Edges first, exits, anomalies. I looked away before he could catch me looking. Pastor Harris was tapping the microphone, doing the throat-clearing thing he always does before announcements. He had a laptop open in front of him, the screen casting a pale blue square onto his shirt collar. Behind him, a pull-down projector screen the size of a garage door waited, blank and humming. "Friends," he said, "we'll be doing our annual digital pledge drive tonight at 7:30 sharp. The portal goes live on the big screen, and you'll see your name come up as you submit your contributions. New this year. Eleanor and Chloe set the whole thing up. So save room for coffee and cake, 7:30. Eleanor smiled with her mouth. I checked my watch. 6:41. I had 49 minutes of folding chair time in a humid linoleum room where my own grandmother had been telling people for 2 years that I was a criminal, and a clock ticking down to a software demonstration that Chloe had built, which was almost certainly going to embarrass somebody. I'd been in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I came inside. Engine off. AC dead. The vinyl steering wheel sticky against my palm. I'd sat there and traced the raised edge of the burn scar across my left palm with my thumb, the way other people work a rosary, and watched the notifications stack up on my phone. 42 unread, none of them from anyone in this building. My grandmother had blocked me on the church WhatsApp in March. Chloe had untagged me from a decade of family photos in April, going back so far she'd untagged me from my own confirmation. I'd noticed it on a Sunday morning at my desk, going through old albums for a photo I needed for a passport renewal. 12 years of Easter dinners, Christmas pageants, the dedication of the new fellowship hall in 2017, where I was standing right next to my grandfather, and his hand was on my shoulder. Untagged. Cropped. In one, somebody had actually edited me out and just left Arthur's hand floating against a beige wall. I'd stared at my grandfather's floating hand for a long time. Then I'd closed the laptop and gone back to work, because I had a critical patch deploying to a banking client at 4 a.m. Eastern, and the people who actually depended on me did not care about my church photos. That was the thing nobody in this hall understood. They didn't see the company. They didn't see the contracts. They didn't see the night. In 2010, when I was 20 years old and standing in a studio apartment in a converted warehouse on Cedar Street, and the server rack I'd built out of secondhand Dell Power Edges started smoking, the breaker hadn't tripped. The smoke alarm hadn't gone off yet. There was just the smell, the sharp electrical smell of insulation cooking, and the orange light starting to bloom behind the perforated metal panel. My grandfather was sitting in a green folding lawn chair in the corner of the apartment. The way he sat there every night that first year, drinking black coffee from a thermos, reading a paperback Western with his reading glasses on the end of his nose. He'd co-signed the lease because the landlord wouldn't take a 20-year-old with no rental history. He told my mother he was buying a fishing boat with his savings and used the money for my first month's deposit instead. When the rack started burning, I didn't think. I grabbed the metal handle of the failing drive bay to pull it out of the chain, because if it shorted into the others, I would lose every line of code I'd written for 18 months, and the client beta would die before it shipped. The metal was hot enough that my skin came away from my palm in a single sheet. I remember the sound more than the pain. The wet hiss. My grandfather standing up out of his lawn chair faster than I'd ever seen him move, wrapping my hand in his army surplus jacket, walking me down 3 flights of stairs to his truck with one hand on the back of my neck saying, "You're all right, soldier. You're all right." Breathing with me the whole way to the emergency room. I was back at the keyboard at 3 a.m. the next morning with my hand bandaged into a club, typing one-handed. He sat in the lawn chair until dawn. He didn't ask me to stop. He just made coffee. He died 18 months later. The company was barely solvent. I was 21. I missed his funeral by 2 hours because a client in Singapore was getting hit with a coordinated intrusion, and there was no one else who could push back the perimeter. My mother stopped speaking to me for a year. Eleanor never started again. I told myself it was a fair trade because the man in the lawn chair would have understood. He was the only one who ever did. He wasn't entirely wrong about me, my grandmother. I had disappeared from this family, not because I was running scams, because I was working, because the work mattered more than the Sunday dinners and the cousins' baby showers and the Easter brunches where Eleanor would pat my hand and ask when I was going to do something real with my life. I let her win those small frames. I let her tell the cousins I was a cautionary tale. I figured the work would speak eventually, the way work does, and I didn't have the energy to fight her with words when I was already fighting $400 million of automated intrusion traffic a quarter. I was wrong about that. The work doesn't speak. Other people speak, and if you don't show up to defend the version of yourself you're letting other people narrate, eventually, that narrated version is the only one anyone remembers. If you think you know where this is going, keep watching. You don't? And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. I'm going to tell you the rest of this the way it happened. The chicken was cold. I ate 2 bites because not eating would have been a flag. Across the table, Mrs. Albertson, who was 78 and had been my Sunday school teacher when I was 7, leaned over and said, in the careful voice people use when they're being kind to someone slightly broken, "Tessa, dear, Eleanor mentioned you have a little online business. I've been getting these phone calls about my Medicare. Could you take a look at my tablet later?" She didn't wait for me to answer. She added, "Or I could just ask Chloe. Eleanor said Chloe would help." "I keep networks secure," I said. "That's all. Chloe's good with social media. She'd be a good place to start. I kept my voice level. I kept my hands under the table. My right wrist was throbbing now, a dull pulse from the seam of my palm up into my elbow. I pressed my thumb against the Velcro and tightened it one notch. The rip-stitch sound was small enough that no one heard it but me. I had offered the workshop in March, a free 4-hour Saturday seminar for the church's senior members on recognizing phishing emails, securing their banking apps, setting up two-factor authentication, and what to do if they thought they'd been compromised. I'd written up a one-page flyer. I'd booked the fellowship hall. I'd printed handouts on my own dime. Pastor Harris had been delighted on the phone. He'd put it in the bulletin. 3 days before the workshop, he called me back. He sounded different. He used the word concerns 4 times in 2 minutes. Some members of the church leadership had concerns. They felt, given Tessa's professional situation, that it might not be appropriate. They felt the seniors might be vulnerable. They felt, and here he'd cleared his throat twice, that it might be wiser to bring in someone from the police community outreach program instead. I'd said, "Eleanor called you." He'd said, "Now, Tessa, that's not exactly." I'd said, "Did she or didn't she?" There had been a long silence, and then he said, "She's worried about the older folks." You have to understand her perspective. That was the end of the workshop. So I sat there in the church hall on a Tuesday in July, eating cold chicken, with my company's threat console quietly logging blocks against state-sponsored intruders in my pocket, and I watched my grandmother work the room. She moved from table to table the way good politicians do. A pat on a forearm here, a whispered word there. At the table nearest mine, she leaned down to speak to a pair of women I recognized from the choir, her voice in that whisper-loud register, carrying just far enough. "She's a cautionary tale," I heard. "She does something with computers that's probably illegal. Don't let her near your phone." She smiled with her mouth and moved on. She stopped at the Miller table and put her hand on the staff sergeant's shoulder, said something that made the deacon laugh, smiled with her mouth again, and moved on. The young Marine didn't laugh. He looked at her hand on his shoulder until she lifted it, and then he looked down at his napkin. At 7:15, Chloe stopped at my table. She didn't sit down. She stood with one hand on the back of the empty chair across from me and said, without quite meeting my eyes, that the church Wi-Fi had been running slow all evening, and she couldn't figure out why. She'd restarted the router twice. She thought it might be the router. "Your subnet mask is misconfigured," I said. "You're leaking packets on port 443. It's not the router." She stared at me for a moment with her mouth slightly open. Then she said, "Oh," and walked away without thanking me. At 7:19, Chloe walked past my table without making eye contact and went up to the front to help Pastor Harris with the laptop. Her hair was freshly highlighted. She was wearing a cardigan I had bought her for her birthday 3 years ago. She still hadn't replied to the text I'd sent her in April, asking why she'd untagged the photos. She bent over the laptop, her face lit blue. I watched her plug an HDMI cable into the side of the machine. I watched her open a browser. I watched her log into something with a password that, from 12 feet away and at a 30-degree angle, I could see she was typing into the URL bar by mistake, then correcting, then typing again. The login screen for the pledge portal came up on the projector behind her, 50 feet wide, with the church logo and a row of dollar amounts. At 7:22, Eleanor stood up. She tapped a spoon against her water glass 3 times, the genteel little chime women of her generation used to summon a room, and the conversations around the hall faded. She smiled. She held her glass at chest height like a candle. "Before Pastor begins the pledge drive," she said, "I just want to say a few words about stewardship and about being careful. We live in dangerous times, brothers and sisters. There are people out there, and sometimes closer than out there, who would use the kindness of a congregation like ours to do harm. She let the pause sit. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. So when you go up to give tonight, you make sure it's the real portal. You make sure it's pastor's screen. And be careful what you click on at home, too. Some people, and here her voice went soft, the way a knife goes soft on a whetstone, make their living that way. A few heads turned toward my table. Not many, just enough. I set my fork down. I reached across my body with my left hand and found the strap on my right wrist, and I pulled it tight. Rip stitch. The Velcro tore and reseated, and the ache in my wrist sharpened into something I could hold on to. The burn scar on my palm caught the overhead fluorescent and went pink at the edges. I didn't look up. I didn't look at her. I picked up my styrofoam cup and drank coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Thank you, Eleanor," Pastor Harris said from the front, with the bright, oblivious warmth of a man who has never once in his life sat in a server room at 3 a.m. Wise words, wise words. "Chloe, are we ready?" Chloe gave him a thumbs up without looking at the screen. At 7:28, the deacon dimmed the overhead lights. The projector got brighter. 200 faces tilted toward the front wall. At 7:29, my phone vibrated once in my pocket. I glanced at it under the table. An alert from my own dashboard. Anomalous outbound traffic on a network I wasn't currently engaged with. Registered to a domain ending in .org. The geolocation matched the building I was sitting in. I felt my stomach drop the way it does when you see a fire start in a room full of children. At 7:30, Pastor Harris clicked the mouse. The pledge portal froze. The dollar amount stuttered. For maybe half a second, the screen went black, and then it came back up red. Pure, saturated, emergency exit red. White lettering an inch high marched across it. Your files have been encrypted. A countdown clock appeared in the corner. 47 hours, 59 minutes, 58 seconds. 57. A synthesized voice, the kind of voice that lives in cheap horror movies, started looping through the speakers Chloe had so carefully tested earlier. "Pay! Now! Pay! Now! Pay!" Someone screamed. An older woman 2 tables over clutched her cross necklace. A child started crying. Chloe took 2 steps back from the laptop with both hands raised, the way you back away from a snake. Pastor Harris said, "Oh dear. Oh, that's... He clicked the mouse. Nothing happened. He clicked it again, faster, the way panicked people do, which is the worst thing you can do to a compromised machine. The countdown ticked. I stood up. I didn't say excuse me. I didn't push my chair in. I set the coffee cup down on the table, and I walked, not fast, not slow, between the chafing dishes and around the long buffet table and up the center aisle of folding chairs, and I felt every head in the room turn to follow me, because I was the woman Eleanor had just warned them about, and now there were sirens coming out of the speakers, and the math their tired brains were doing was the wrong math, and I didn't have time to correct it. Pastor Harris saw me coming. His face did something complicated. "Tessa, honey, I don't think..." I put my left hand flat on the table next to the laptop. The burn scar caught the red light from the screen and went the color of a brand. I said, "Move!" He moved. I sat down in his chair. I pulled the laptop toward me by the lid. I unplugged the HDMI cable, then plugged it back in, because I needed the projector to keep showing what I was about to do. I needed Eleanor to see it on a screen 50 feet wide. The synthesized voice was still chanting. I muted the laptop with a single key. The hall went quiet enough to hear the projector fan whining and someone in the back coughing into a fist. I opened a terminal. A black box bloomed in the center of the red screen, a blinking cursor. The room behind me made a small collective sound. the sound a congregation makes when it doesn't understand what it's seeing and is deciding whether to be afraid of it. I started typing. My right wrist screamed under the brace. I ignored it. I had typed through worse. I had typed through the fire. The mechanical keyboard wasn't mine. It was some cheap membrane thing the church had bought at a big box store, but my fingers knew the shape of the commands the way a pianist's fingers know a sonata. I killed the malicious process by PID. I severed the laptop's network connection at the adapter level. I dropped into the router's admin panel through a backdoor I'd built 6 years ago for a client who had since become a client of half the federal government, and I quarantined the entire subnet. The ransomware pop-up was still on the screen, but it was now talking to nothing, a severed head still moving its mouth. Then I opened my own console. Drummond Sentinel loaded. The login took 2 seconds. I authenticated with a hardware key on my keychain that I had pulled out of my pocket without thinking about it. The interface bloomed onto the projector wall in its proprietary blue, the color I had picked out of a Pantone book in 2011, sitting on the floor of an apartment that smelled like ozone and ramen, with my grandfather in a lawn chair drinking coffee out of a thermos. The logo loaded. A simple thing. A shield with a line of code running through it and the word Sentinel underneath. In a font I'd licensed myself. 50 feet wide, on the wall of my grandmother's church. I started the trace. The console threw up a map. Origin nodes lit up in 3 countries. Attack vector identified. A spoofed email opened on the church laptop sometime in the last 6 hours, almost certainly by Chloe, almost certainly while she was logged into the church's bank-linked giving portal. The payload was a known variant. My platform had a signature for it. I deployed the counter, watched the encrypted files on the laptop start decrypting in real time, a progress bar climbing in the corner of the screen. Behind me, somewhere in the rows of folding chairs, I heard the heavy, rhythmic click of dress shoes on linoleum. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the screen. The footsteps came up the center aisle, slow, measured. The way a man walks who has learned to walk that way in a place very far from a church basement in July. They stopped a few feet behind my chair. "Ma'am," a voice said. I finished the command. I hit enter. The progress bar reached 100%. The red screen folded itself away and the pledge portal came back up. Clean. The church logo and the row of dollar amounts untouched. The frantic typing stopped. The ransomware alarm was gone. The room was dead silent except for the hum of the projector cooling fan and the faint smell of floor wax and ozone rising from the linoleum around the table. I turned in the chair. Staff Sergeant David Miller stood at parade rest in the center aisle of his father's church, in a pressed button-down shirt and slacks, his high and tight haircut catching the projector light. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, at the screen, at the blue Sentinel logo that had reloaded behind the pledge portal as a watermark in the corner. His jaw worked once. "That command line," he said. His voice was quiet. The room was quiet enough that it carried. "That terminal. That's a Drummond Sentinel interface." I didn't say anything. He looked at me then. His eyes went to the brace on my right wrist and to the scar on my left palm where it rested on the table, and back to my face. "You're Drummond." "Yes." He took a breath that lifted his shoulders and let it out slowly through his nose. Then he did something I didn't expect. He came to attention. Not theatrically. Just a small adjustment of his feet and shoulders, the body remembering a shape it knew. He turned, not to face me, but to face the room, to face the table where his father sat with his mouth slightly open, to face the table, too, over where Eleanor was still standing, her water glass still in her hand, the spoon still resting against the rim. "Folks," he said, "I need a minute." Pastor Harris said, from somewhere near the wall, "David's son, maybe we should—" "I need a minute, Pastor." Pastor Harris stopped talking. David Miller looked at my grandmother. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The fluorescent hum and the projector fan were the only competition, and he had been trained by a government to be heard over louder things than that. "Mrs. Drummond," he said, "last March, I was deployed. Helmand Province. While I was over there, a fishing ring went after the financial accounts of 60 Marine families in my battalion. They had our spouses' names. They had our kids' schools. They sent emails that looked like they came from the credit union we all use. They were going to clean us out while we were 8,000 miles away and couldn't pick up a phone." The water glass in Eleanor's hand was trembling. Just slightly. Just enough that the spoon ticked once against the rim. He turned his head, slow, and looked directly at my grandmother. "Your granddaughter didn't just fix a laptop. Last year, a fishing ring went after the financial accounts of 60 Marine families while my unit was deployed. Her platform detected it and killed it before a single dime was stolen. She saved our life savings, and you introduced her as a scammer." The water glass ticked again. Somebody in the back of the hall said audibly, "Oh, Eleanor." I stood up from the laptop. I closed the lid gently. I turned to face the room and I let them see me. The brace, the scar, the exhaustion under my eyes from the late shift I'd worked the night before and the late shift I was going to work as soon as I got home. I looked at Eleanor. She had finally set the water glass down. Her hand was on the back of the chair in front of her like she needed it. Her mouth had gone the shape it goes when she is about to deliver a smaller, softer version of whatever she just said, the way she always recovers, the pat on the forearm, the gentle correction. She said. "I was just protecting the congregation. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," I said. The room went still. "You didn't ask what I did. You just decided what I was." I walked out from behind the table. I stopped a few feet from her, close enough that I didn't have to raise my voice, far enough that I wasn't reaching. "I didn't build it for people who understand it, Eleanor. I built it for people who need it. You just happen to be one of them." She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. Nothing came out. Behind her, a woman I had known since I was 6 years old, a woman whose son's wedding photos I had once been in and was no longer in, pushed her chair back from the table and stood up. She didn't say anything to Eleanor. She just walked around the table and came toward me with both hands held out, palms up, the way people do when they want to hold something and don't know how to ask. Then the deacon stood up. Then a man at the next table. Then a woman 3 rows back with a walker, slowly, her daughter helping her, both of them looking past Eleanor as if Eleanor wasn't there. Eleanor was still holding the back of the chair, her hand on the wood, her mouth slightly open, the spoon resting against the rim of the water glass, finally still. 200 people in a church hall, and the only person not moving toward me was the woman who had spent 10 years telling them who I was. I don't remember picking up my bag. I remember Mrs. Halloran asking me if her tablet was safe, and I remember saying yes. And I remember Deacon Miller shaking my hand with both of his, and I remember a man whose name I had forgotten asking me if I would come look at his wife's email because she kept getting messages from someone pretending to be their grandson. I told him yes. I gave him a card from the inside pocket of my jacket. I gave out 4 more before I reached the door. I didn't look at Eleanor again. I didn't have to. I could feel where she was standing the way you feel a draft in a room, a low cold spot near the head table, untouched. Pastor Harris was beside her. He wasn't speaking to her. He was looking at the projector screen, at the logo still glowing 50 feet wide across the wall behind the buffet, and he had the expression of a man recalculating every conversation he'd had in the last 2 years. Staff Sergeant David Miller held the door open for me. "Ma'am," he said. I stopped. I looked up at him. Up close he was younger than I'd expected, maybe 26. the high and tight crisp at the edges, a small razor nick on his jaw where he'd shaved that morning. "My wife's name is Rachel," he said. "We have 2 kids. The fishing thing, when it happened, we had $11,000 in a joint account and a deployment paycheck about to drop. If your software hadn't caught it, we'd have lost all of it before I got back stateside. I never knew who to thank. I'm thanking you now." I didn't trust my voice. I nodded. He nodded back. He let the door close behind me. The parking lot air hit me like a different country. The humidity had broken sometime during the dinner. A cool wind was moving through the maples at the far end of the lot, the leaves turning their pale undersides up, the street lights buzzing on one by one along the access road. I walked to my car. I didn't hurry. I unlocked it, sat down, closed the door, and put both hands on the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time. My phone was in my bag on the passenger seat. I could feel it through the canvas, the small, steady pulse of notifications coming in. I didn't reach for it yet. I traced the raised edge of the burn scar on my left palm with my thumb. 15. 15 years old, that scar. The night the server rack went up, my grandfather was in the lawn chair in the corner the way he always was that first year. The smell came first, the sharp, dry ozone, and then the orange light from behind the rack. And then the choice, 2 seconds of choice. Do I let it burn and lose 3 months of work, or do I reach in? I reached in. He was on his feet before I could make a sound. He wrapped my hand in his army surplus jacket, walked me down 3 flights of stairs with one hand on the back of my neck, and sat with me in the emergency room until 4 in the morning. He didn't ask why I'd reached for the metal. He looked at my bandaged hand, at the salvaged drive I had carried down with my good hand, and he said, "Next time, call me first." Then he sat down in the lawn chair and made coffee. He stayed for 2 days. He died 18 months later. He never saw the platform go to scale. He never met a single one of the 60 Marine families. I sat in the parking lot until my breathing went even. Then I pulled my phone out of the bag. 17 messages. I scrolled past the names I didn't want to read first. Pastor Harris, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, a second cousin, a woman from the choir who had once told my mother I had an unfriendly face. Chloe's message was near the top. 3 paragraphs. I could see the shape of it before I read a word. The long apology, the self-recrimination, the small, careful request at the end. I should have said something. I should have asked. "I'm so sorry. Can we talk?" I read it once. I muted the thread. Eleanor's message was the last one, time-stamped 9:14 p.m., which meant she had waited almost an hour after I left to send it. I could picture her at the kitchen table in the house on Linden, the same table she'd been writing condolence cards at for 40 years, choosing the words. "We need to talk about this." 5 words. No apology in them, no acknowledgement. Just the same gentle imperative she had used my whole life. The soft instruction that always sounded like care and always meant compliance. I read it. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. I started the car. The drive home was 22 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. The city slid past the windshield the way it always does at that hour, the late traffic thinning out, the lights changing in patterns I had stopped noticing years ago and noticed again tonight. The streetlights along Vermont Avenue came on, in a rolling sequence, north to south, each one igniting maybe half a second after the one before it. A clean cascade. I thought about server nodes coming online in a data center, the same rhythm, the same quiet competence. 10,000 small machines waking up in the dark to do their work whether anyone was watching or not. The wind through the cracked window smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. At a red light on 9th, I undid the Velcro on my right wrist. The rip-stitch sound was loud inside the car. I pulled the brace off. I set it on the passenger seat next to my phone. I flexed my wrist, slowly, the joint stiff and sore the way it always was at the end of a long day. I rubbed the soft inside of the wrist where the brace had been. The light turned green. I drove the rest of the way home with my hand bare on the wheel. My apartment was on the 4th floor of a brick building I had moved into 9 years ago, 3 years after the company started making money, 4 years after my grandfather died. I'd kept the lease cheap on purpose. I didn't want a house. I wanted walls I could see all 4 of from my desk. I climbed the stairs. I unlocked the door. I set my keys in the bowl by the entry, the way he had taught me to when I was 9 years old and kept losing them. The apartment was dark and quiet. My work monitor was on standby, a slow pulse of blue from the corner of the room. The window was open 2 inches. The radiator ticked. I went to the desk. The framed photograph was where it always was, on the left side of the monitor stand, angled so I could see it when I looked up from the keyboard. My grandfather in his army dress uniform, 19 years old in the picture. He had been a corporal then, before Korea, before the burn pit on his left forearm that he never explained and I never asked about. He was looking just slightly off camera, the way people did in photographs in 1952. His jaw set, his eyes already the eyes I remembered. I picked the photograph up. I held it for a second. I set it back down. I sat in my chair. The leather was cool. I rolled my shoulders out, the right one popping the way it always did. I touched the space bar. The monitors came up, 3 of them in a soft arc, the center one already loaded with the late shift dashboard. Drummond Sentinel, live feed, the global threat map breathing in slow pulses across the screen. A small alert in the top corner. A medium severity event out of Frankfurt contained. My night team lead already on it. 2 flagged anomalies in the financial sector queue, a clean run on the federal contracts. 3,412 blocked login attempts in the last hour, and the number ticked up to 413 while I watched. I pulled up the terminal. Here, the cursor blinked at me, patient. The way it had blinked at me at 20 years old in a studio apartment with a lawn chair in the corner and a man drinking black coffee in it. I typed my login. The system recognized me. Welcome back, Drummond. Somewhere across the city, in a server farm I had built and named after a road my grandfather grew up on, the racks were humming. I couldn't hear them from here. I didn't need to. I knew the sound. I pulled up the night queue. I opened the first flag. I started reading. The phone buzzed once on the desk beside me. I didn't look at it. It buzzed again 20 minutes later. I finished the line I was reading, closed the flag, opened the next one. Around 11 o'clock, I made coffee. Black. I drank it standing at the window, looking down at Vermont Avenue, at the streetlights still doing their slow cascade, at a city full of people who didn't know my name and didn't need to. The cool air came in through the open window. I could smell the rain finally starting somewhere east of the river. I went back to the desk. I worked until almost 3 in the morning. I cleared the queue. I left a note for the day shift. I ran a sweep on a client network in Singapore that had been pinging weird since Tuesday. I patched a small thing. I documented it. I closed the terminal. I looked up. The photograph caught the faint reflection of the monitor light, the blue edge of it touching the corner of the frame, the corner of his jaw. He looked the way he always looked. Steady. Watching. Like he had a lawn chair pulled up just out of frame. I reached over and turned the picture a 1/4 inch, the way I always did, so he was facing the chair instead of the screen. "Good night," I said. I shut the monitors down. The servers hummed, a low, steady rhythm in the dark. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace. If you've ever had someone in your family decide who you were, and then spend years telling everyone else that version, while the real work of your life went on in a room they never bothered to walk into, I'd like to know what you finally did about it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are tonight, what city, what shift you're working, what you've built, that the people closest to you have never once asked about. I read them. I read all of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. There are more stories like mine waiting, and I think the people in them would want you to hear them. Good night.